Bishwa's Institute of Management Studies. Excellent coaching by chartered accountants for CA, CMA and CS. Our specialities: strict and result-oriented training, well-equipped air-conditioned classrooms, free library and internet facility, extra coaching for science students, separate hostel facilities for boys and girls, and classes handled by chartered accountants. Bishwa's Institute of Management Studies, Tengana, Changanashiri. To get further details, visit www.bishwaseducation.com.
Good afternoon, dear students. Today, we are going to deal with residential status of all persons. It is very important. Why it is so important? Because taxability of a person is determined by the residential status. If he is a non-resident, a taxability is in a way. If he is a resident, it is in another way. So, it is very important to determine whether he is a resident or not. So, we are going to deal with residential status of all persons. The first person is individual. First of all, we are going to analyze the residential status of individuals. In the case of individual, a person is treated as a resident if he satisfies any of the basic conditions. If he satisfies any of the basic conditions, he will be treated as a resident. So, an individual is a resident when he satisfies any, I'm stressing, any of the basic conditions. Now, I have to say which are the basic conditions. First basic condition is he is in India for 182 days or more. He is in India for 182 days or more for the previous year. What does it mean by previous year? The year under consideration. So, let the previous year be 2013-14. In the year 2013-14, if he stays in India for 182 days or more, he has satisfied the first basic condition. Okay? Very simple. Just count his stay in India. If he has stayed in India for 182 days or more, he can be termed as a resident. We need not go for any further test because we have concluded that he is a resident. If he is not satisfying this condition, so we can call it first basic condition. If he is not satisfying the first basic condition, don't go for the conclusion that he is a non-resident. Because we have to analyze whether he has satisfied the second basic condition. If he has not satisfied the first basic condition, go for the second basic condition. What is the second basic condition? He is in India for 60 days or more. 60 days or more. And why I am stressing and? By just being 60 days, we cannot say anything. 60 days stay in the previous year. 60 days stay in the previous year. By seeing it alone, we cannot say anything. He has to stay in India in the previous year for 60 days and in India for 365 days in the 4 years preceding the previous year. Out of the 4 years preceding the previous year, he has to be in India for 365 days and he has to satisfy both together. He has to be in India for 60 days. in the previous year, and stress it, and he has stayed in India for 365 days. He has stayed in India for 365 days out of the 4 years. Out of the 4 years, stress it, out of the 4 years preceding the previous year. What does it mean by preceding previous years? 2013-14 is the year under consideration. 4 years preceding it. What is that? 2012-13, 2011-12, 2010-11, 2009-10. Out of these 4 years, he has stayed in India for 365 days. It need not be together. Any days. It can be 60 in this year, 120 here, like that. Or it can be together 365 days in 10, 11. Anyway, he has to be in India for 365 days and 60 days in the previous year. If he satisfies the second condition, second basic condition has two parts together, it should happen together, then he is a resident. So to be a resident, he is in India for 182 days. No more test, he is a resident. If he is not a resident, that means if he is a non-resident, don't conclude that he is a non-resident. We have to further test this, then only we can conclude that he is a non-resident. What is the second test? Whether he has stayed in India for 60 days in the previous year and he is in India for 360 days for 4 years preceding the previous year. If he satisfies any of the basic conditions, he is a resident. If he is not satisfying both the conditions, that means he is not satisfying any condition, then he is a non-resident. Clear? But we have to note a particular point. This second condition is not applicable for certain persons. That means there is an exception to the basic conditions. Basic conditions means there are two basic conditions. And there is an exception for certain persons in the case of second basic conditions. That means to be a resident, they have to satisfy the first basic condition. In their case, we need not go for the second test. Clear? Who are they? Two categories of persons. First category, persons leaving India for an employment outside India. Persons or Indian citizens leaving India for an employment outside India. Just consider a situation. Our brother, who is a non-resident, then going outside for India. He has gone last year. He has gone last year means he has satisfied this part. That means he will be in India for 365 days out of the 4 years, certainly. And he has just come for a vacation of 62 days or 70 days. He becomes a resident and his global income is taxed, a horrible situation. So, an exemption is given to such persons. Indian citizens leaving India for employment, or leaving India for employment, or we can say that they are leaving India as a crew of an Indian ship. They also. So, two types of persons leaving India for employment outside India, and a crew as a crew of an Indian ship. They are excused from second basic condition. Clear? So the first category of persons who are excused from second basic condition is one, persons leaving India in two different ways. First way, as an employee for an employment outside India, or as a member of the crew of an Indian ship. Have you understood the first category of persons? Exceptions. First category, is it clear? And there is a second category of persons who is also excused. What is that? A person of Indian origin. A person, an individual of Indian origin comes to India just for a visit. And he has stayed for 60, 62, 63 days. And by staying here, his or her income is taxed. It's a horrible situation. Just for a visit. Just come to India to visit our kith and kin. So then there is an issue. Who is a person of Indian origin? If an individual or his parents, either of his parents or either of his grandparents are born in undivided India, he can be called a person of Indian origin. If he is a person of Indian origin, he is excused from second basic conditions. So there are two categories of persons who are excused from second basic conditions. Who are they? First category is a person leaving India for employment or as a member of crew of an Indian ship. Second category of persons who is excused is a person coming to India for a visit. Which type of person? A person of Indian origin, an individual of Indian origin. That person of Indian origin has gone outside for what purpose? For an employment or for anything, for a vacation, anything. They have gone outside and they have come to India for a visit. And they have been excused or exempted from the second basic condition. What does it mean? In their case, we need not go for the second test. They will be residents if and only if they satisfy the first basic condition. In all other cases, we have to test both the conditions. If they satisfy any of the basic conditions, they will become a resident. Is it okay? Is it clear? So we have found how to find the residential status of an individual. So we have found an individual. We have determined that he is a resident or a non-resident. This will be the conclusion, isn't it? After analyzing the first basic condition, we can reach into only two options. Either we will be concluding that they are resident, or we will be concluding that they are non-residents. And if we are concluding that he is a non-resident, our test is over. But if we are concluding that he is a resident, we have to test further. We have to test whether he is a resident and ordinary resident, or no, we have to test whether he is a resident and ordinarily resident, or he is a resident but not ordinarily resident. This is the test to be made. If he is a resident only, we are going for further test. Clear? We are going for additional conditions to test whether they are resident and ordinary resident or resident but ordinary resident. Anyway, they are resident. Why? Because since he is a resident, we have gone further. Clear? And now we are going to deal with additional conditions. What are the additional conditions? Additional conditions. For what purpose additional conditions are tested? To determine whether they are resident and ordinary resident, whether they are resident but not ordinary resident. These additional conditions are presented in the Act in a way. I am presenting it in a different way for the easiness. So I shall say additional condition. Our additional conditions are like this. First additional condition: he is in India for 730 days out of 7 years preceding the previous year. We are testing whether he is in India for 730 days out of the preceding years of the previous year. We should not consider the days of previous year. We have to consider the days of preceding years of the previous year. That means if we are considering the residential status of an individual in the case of 2013-14, in the additional condition test, we should not take into consideration any of the days stay in 2013-14. we have to consider the days of stay in the 7 years preceding the previous year. Clear? If he is in India for 730 days out of the 7 years, 730 days out of the 7 years preceding the previous year. And the second basic condition is, he is a resident for 2 years out of the 10 years preceding the previous year. What is that? We are considering whether this resident was resident for 2 years preceding the preceding the years. 10 preceding years of the previous year. Just see, in 2013-14, we are analyzing 2013-14. We are going for the test 10 previous years. What does it mean? 2013-14 is the year of our consideration. 10 years means 2012-13, 2011-12, like that. We have to consider 10 years. Out of these 10 years, any 2 years, out of the 10 years, any 2 years, he was a resident. First condition was whether he stayed in India for 7 years. Out of the 7 years, he stayed in India for 730 days. Out of the 10 years, he was a resident. If he satisfies both the additional conditions, so I can use the term and here. If he satisfies both the additional conditions, he is a resident and ordinarily resident. Is it okay? He is a resident and ordinary resident only if he satisfies both the additional conditions. Only if he satisfies both the additional conditions. That means if he is not satisfying any of the additional conditions, he will not be a resident and ordinarily resident. If a person is not a resident and not resident, surely he will be a resident but not ordinary resident. He will not be a non-resident. Why? Because these additional conditions are tested only in the case of resident. That's why we are saying that they will be resident but not ordinarily resident. So, an individual will be a non-resident or a resident. If he is a resident, he will be either a resident and ordinary resident or a resident but not ordinarily resident. That's all for residential status of individual. Okay? It's clear? Very much clear? Now we can go for residential status of an HUF. What is an HUF? Hindu undivided family. In the case of Hindu undivided family, we have to test like this, whether he is a resident, it is a resident or not. There also, we are analyzing the same step. First of all, we have to analyze whether this HUF is a resident or not. So, we will conclude that he is a resident or non-resident. If it is a non-resident, we can conclude the steps. If he is a resident, that if HUF is a resident, we should go further. We have to analyze, just like in the last case, we have to analyze further. How? Let it be the result will be resident and ordinarily resident, resident but not ordinarily resident. And one more thing you should note, that this type of analysis is made only in the case of individual and HUF. Only in the case of individual and HUF, residents are further subdivided into resident and ordinary resident and resident but not ordinary resident. In all other cases, in all other persons, the analysis only made only as resident and non-resident. Resident is not further classified. That means further classification of a resident is made only in the case of individual and HUF. We have already dealt with all the aspects of individual. Now we are going for resident status of HUF, Hindu undivided family. So in the case of Hindu undivided family, to Hindu undivided family. In the case of Hindu undivided family, a Hindu undivided family is treated as a resident if the control and management is wholly or partly in India. The test is not the stay, but the test is based on the control and management. This HUF is controlled from India or not. If the HUF, everything is India, but full control is from outside India, we cannot say that it is a resident. Clear? To be a resident, the control and management should be in India. It should be controlled from India, at least in part. That's why it said that control and management wholly or partly in India. It's not compulsory that the full control must be in India. It's not compulsory. The full control is not necessary. At least in part, there should be a control from India. So, if the control and management is wholly or partly in India, we can say that the HUF is a resident. Is it clear? So, residential status of HUF is not determined by the period of stay. Why? It is not considered by the period of stay. HUF, how can we analyze the period of stay? HUF, can we go anywhere else? No. HUF, where it is, there will be. So, we cannot analyze HUF based on period of stay. So, instead of period of stay, we are concluding whether it is a resident or non-resident by testing how, whether the control and management is wholly or partly in India. Is it okay? Is it very much clear? And we have reached into a conclusion that HUF is resident, or we have reached into a conclusion that HUF is non-resident. If the conclusion is non-resident, we can stop further test. No more test is required. But if the HUF is a resident, we have to go for further test. How? What is the further test? Whether the HUF is a resident and ordinary resident, or resident but ordinary resident, is not decided by anything of HUF but of the Karta. We know that the Karta is most important person in the case of HUF. So the additional conditions, whether the additional conditions are satisfied by Karta, it is being tested. If the HUF is a resident, then we have to test whether the Karta satisfies both the additional conditions. In the case of individual, we are testing whether individual is in India, we are testing the additional conditions in the case of individual. But in the case of HUF, we have decided, based on the control and management, we have decided whether resident or non-resident. If the HUF is a resident, further analysis is going. How? Based on whether additional conditions are satisfied by Karta. If Karta satisfies both the additional conditions, the HUF, the resident HUF, is a resident and non-resident. If Karta violates or not satisfying any of the additional conditions, we can say that HUF is a resident but not ordinarily resident. Is it clear? Is it clear? So we have concluded the residential status of HUF. What is the basic points to be noted? What are the basic points? In the case of HUF, residential status is decided based on control and management, but further classification of a resident is based on whether Karta satisfies additional conditions or not. Clear? Perfect. Now we are going for the residential status of firm. Firm, AOP, BOI. What is firm? A partnership firm. What is AOP? Association of persons. What is BOI? Body of individuals. In their case, the residential status is determined just like HUF. Then why couldn't I say it together? No. In the case of HUF, we are subdividing residential status. If HUF is a resident, we will be subdividing it into resident and non-resident and resident but not resident. But in the case of FAME, AOP and BOI, in the case of FAME, AOP and BOI, we are not doing this subclassification. That is the only difference between this and that. Clear? How we found in the case of HUF whether they are resident or not? If the control and management is wholly or partly in India, we were saying that HUF is a resident. Similarly, we can say that if the control and management wholly or partly in India, we can say that FAME, AOP or BOI are resident. Clear? And we are deciding whether they are resident or non-resident. Stop it. Need not go further because further analysis is made only in the case of individual and HUF. Is it okay? Is it okay? That's all. Now we have completed FAME, AOP and BOI also. What are these we have covered? First one, individual, we completed. Then we completed HUF. Now we have completed FAME, AOP and BOI. So we have analyzed the residential status of individual, HUF, FAME, AOP, BOI. The only persons remaining are the artificial juridical persons and local authority. And fifth one, company. So, residential status of all persons other than these two sections are over. Now we can deal with artificial juridical persons and local authority. Their residential status also determined by the same procedures followed in the case of HUF and FAME, etc., etc. That means they will be treated as resident if the control and management is wholly or partly in India. If the control and management is wholly or partly in India, in this situation also, they are treated as resident. So, we can say that all these cases, residential status is determined like this. How? If the control and management is wholly or partly in India, they will be treated as resident. And if the control and management is not wholly or partly in India, that means if fully outside India, we can say that they are non-resident. Is it okay? And the only remaining person is company. In the case of company, the residential status is determined as follows. How? Any company, if it is an Indian company defined under section 226, if it is an Indian company, then surely we need not go for further any analysis. We can say that an Indian company is always a resident. An Indian company is always a resident. We have already learned earlier how we can find Indian company, how can we classify Indian company, that all we have dealt with. So if it is an Indian company, under section 226, we can say that that company is a resident. So first situation, if a company is an Indian company, need not test any other thing, we can say that it is a resident. And second case, any company other than Indian company, any company other than Indian company also can become a resident by, if the control and management is wholly in India, It's not an Indian company, but the control and management is wholly in India. We will be doing like this. We will be register a company outside India, but full control is from India. Then we cannot escape that we are not an Indian company, we are a foreign company. We cannot say. If it is an Indian company, it's a resident. If it is not an Indian company, then also it becomes resident by control and management wholly being in India. Not a special point. There, partly control is not enough. Full control. Wholly should be controlled from India. And these two companies are residents. All other companies are non-residents. So it's very simple. So how resident status of a company is determined? If it's an Indian company, it's a resident. If any other company satisfies the condition that the control and management is wholly in India, we can say that that company is also a resident. Two types of companies. First one, Indian company under section 226. Second one, any other company being control and management wholly in India is resident. All other companies are non-residents. So we have successfully covered everything related to residential status. By this we have covered everything related to the residential status of every person. Individual, HUF, FAME, PBI, artificial juridical person and local authority, and company. So that's all for the day. We can go for the classes regarding taxability of according to the residential status in the next class. So that's all for the day. We can conclude. Thank you.
Bishwas Institute of Management Studies. Excellent coaching by chartered accountants for CA, CMA and CS. Our specialities: strict and result-oriented training, well-equipped air-conditioned classrooms, free library and internet facility, extra coaching for science students, separate hostel facilities for boys and girls, and classes handled by chartered accountants. Bishwas Institute of Management Studies, Tengana, Changanashiri. To get further details, visit www.bishwaseducation.com.